The forest was silent under heavy snow. Pines lined the ridgeline like sentinels, their branches weighed down by fresh powder, unmoving. In the open valley below, a lake lay frozen, vast, smooth, untouched. A thin mist curled low across the ice, whispering from one end to the other as if carrying messages too cold to hear. From the trees came a pack of wolves, 7 in all, their fur thick with frost, their breath clouding in the morning air. They moved in perfect rhythm, paws almost silent against the frozen crust of snow, only the crunch of buried twigs betraying their presence. Leading them was the alpha, a broad-shouldered male with a graying muzzle and dark, amber eyes. He stopped at the lake's edge, ears twitching. Behind him, the others waited. The lake stretched before them like an invitation. Crossing it would cut hours from their route. The wind was soft, the silence perfect. The alpha stepped forward, but then something happened. A sound, so deep, so low it barely registered in the ear, rolled through the ice. Not a crack. A tone. Subsonic. Felt more in bone than heard. The alpha froze, his ears flattened. He turned his head sharply to the north, away from the center of the lake, and without a sound, veered left. The rest of the pack followed immediately. No signal, no bark, no tension, just instinct. They curved their path away from the lake's heart, tracing the edge instead of crossing. 20 meters out, they stopped again. The last wolf, a smaller female, paused mid-step, staring over the lake. Her paw hovered above the snow. And then the sound came again, this time louder, this time followed by motion. A fracture line, so thin it was almost invisible, shot through the surface of the ice, slicing a jagged line from the center toward where the wolves had originally aimed to cross. A second line branched off, then a third. The frozen lake groaned, flexed. Beneath the surface, trapped air hissed upward in icy bubbles that shimmered under the frost. The wolves stood motionless. Then, with eerie calm, they turned and slipped back into the woods. The lake held, but just barely. Something ancient, heavy, and shifting had stirred beneath the ice. The snow fell silently again, covering the cracks as though nothing had happened. But the forest had noticed, and it would not forget. 2 days later, the forest ranger station on the northern ridge received an unusual report. Strange booms echoing across the lake during the night. Not thunder, not gunshots. Something lower. A bass-heavy pressure wave, locals said. Felt in the chest before it reached the ears. Ranger Talia Voss took the call just after 7 a.m., still half-dressed and sipping instant coffee. She'd heard it too, a muffled reverberation through the cabin floor sometime near 3 a.m. Her window had rattled in its frame, but the sky had been clear. No storms, no aircraft, and no earthquakes reported. At least, none yet. Pulling on her parka and radio, she drove the old snowmobile down toward the lake. It was barely sunrise, and the air was sharp enough to crack lips within minutes. The pines lining the trail looked almost black against the pinkish sky, their branches crusted with rime. When she arrived at the lake's edge, something felt off. Not wrong, just different. The kind of different that makes animals go silent. The lake from a distance looked intact, solid, white, unremarkable. But as she approached the shore on foot, she noticed the pattern, long, jagged fractures running just beneath the surface of the ice, perfectly spaced, too straight to be random. They looked like stress lines, as if something beneath had shifted and was pushing up gently but deliberately. Talia knelt by the edge and removed her glove. She pressed her palm flat to the ice. It was cold. Of course it was. But after a moment she felt it. A hum. Soft, rhythmic. Almost like a heartbeat. Startled, she drew her hand back. Listened. Nothing. But her instincts tightened. She rose and walked parallel to the shore. About 20 meters down, a small set of tracks caught her eye. Wolf prints, leading from the forest to the lake, and then turning sharply away. She crouched low. 7 sets, large and fresh, preserved perfectly in the snow. The wolves had come here, probably just before the first fracture event But they hadn't crossed. They had known. She stood up slowly, eyes on the lake's surface. It hadn't cracked fully yet, but it was going to. Of that, she was suddenly certain. Not because of the ice thickness, not because of weather, but because something beneath the lake was shifting. And this wasn't over. The following morning, frost clung like armor to every branch in the valley. The lake was still, a great white sheet of silence. But under its surface, change had begun. Deep below the ice, beneath the sediment and clay layers, compacted over centuries, a fault line shifted. Not violently, but with intent. A fraction of a millimeter, barely measurable. But it was enough. The pressure had been building for decades, and the crust was no longer holding evenly. The ice above acted like a sealed lid on a pressurized vessel, and now, unseen from the surface, cold water was beginning to churn. In the ranger station, Talia had downloaded the latest geotech satellite pass. It wasn't normal practice, not for small faults like these, but something about the lake's silence gnawed at her. She examined the heat signatures first. Everything looked normal. No geothermal leaks, no obvious rises in temperature. Then, she overlaid sonar data from old geological surveys just to see. That's when she noticed it. A hollow. A void. Natural, wide, and uncharted, beneath the northern end of the lakebed. Possibly an ancient underground cave system, long sealed off and dry. Only now, it didn't look dry anymore. Moisture readings along the northern edge had spiked by 4.2% in just 3 days. That meant water was seeping downward, or worse, being drawn into something below. Meanwhile, the wolves had not returned. Local guides noted they hadn't been seen on the usual trails. No new tracks, no calls at night. It was as if the entire pack had slipped away beyond the ridges, far from the lake, obeying instincts that science still couldn't quantify. At noon, Talia hiked out alone to the center of the lake with seismic microphones buried in her pack. She wore ice spikes and moved carefully. The surface held, smooth and brittle, like old glass. The wind had dropped, no birds, no movement. She stopped at the lake's center and set one of the mics. Then the sound came. Pop, not loud, not sharp, but unmistakably from beneath. She froze. 10 seconds, 20. Another pop, then creak, then silence. She looked around, a 360-degree sweep of stillness. The world seemed suspended. Then came the vibration. Not enough to knock her off balance, but enough to remind her that she was standing on a crust above something shifting, something alive in the geological sense. She marked her data, stood slowly, and backed away without turning her back to the ice. Something was coming, and it wouldn't announce itself with violence. Not yet. It would whisper first. Then it would break. The snow that fell overnight erased all tracks, all memory of the wolves, and even Talia's prints across the lake. But it didn't erase the stress lines beneath. They remained, veins of tension spidering through the ice, delicate but deadly, waiting. Talia sat hunched in the ranger station, studying the waveform printouts from the seismic mic she had left behind. The lines didn't look catastrophic. No obvious tremor spikes, no quakes. But there were patterns, regular pulses, rhythmic, and that was wrong. Nature was rarely so exact. She ran the data through the signal filter twice. The spacing between each pop and grind deep below the lake was mathematically consistent. Too consistent. Almost like breathing, or like something regulating pressure. At first, she thought maybe it was water seeping into new cavities, air escaping through thawing permafrost. But when she matched the frequency against geological archives, a chill spread through her. The closest match wasn't natural seepage. It was glacial shearing, the slow internal failure that sometimes led to ice shelf collapse in the Arctic. But they weren't in the Arctic. They were in a remote mountain forest, and the lake wasn't fed by a glacier. Whatever was down there was starting to move. Talia gathered her gear and went out again before dusk. She didn't trust the lake anymore. Her goal now wasn't to record. It was to map the cracks before they disappeared again under snowfall. As she approached the shore, she noticed something unusual. A fox, sitting still at the tree line, watching the lake. Its fur was puffed out against the cold, its ears forward, unmoving. It didn't blink. It wasn't hunting. It was listening. Talia slowed her steps. The fox turned its head slightly, toward the lake's center, and then bolted back into the woods without a sound. That's when she heard the groan. Low. Wide. It didn't come from a single point. It came from everywhere beneath the lake at once. The ice didn't crack. It flexed. A massive, slow exhale from the Earth's underlayer. The snow on the lake's surface jittered, lifted slightly, then settled again as if nothing happened. But Talia saw it, a fracture line she hadn't mapped before, a new one, long and curling. It wasn't random. It curved toward the edge, toward her. She stepped back instinctively, heart pounding. Her breath fogged in front of her, and for a moment she thought she saw movement under the ice. A shadow, long and slow, gone. Whatever was happening beneath the surface was escalating, not with a quake, not yet, but with something worse, a slow unraveling. By morning, the lake was no longer silent. Talia stood at the ranger station's window, coffee untouched, eyes fixed on the stillness outside. But she knew. The stillness was only surface deep. The ice looked unbroken, but her data told a different story. The center of the lake was warming, just slightly, by a fraction of a degree, but enough. Enough to signal that the ice's core was thinning. She had called into HQ twice. The first time, they didn't take her seriously. The second time, she sent over heat maps, seismic recordings, and satellite overlays. That got them listening. Now a small team was en route, but they'd be a day out at best. Until then, she was alone. The animals were vanishing. No birdsong, no deer on the ridge, not even crows, only empty prints where they once crossed. The forest was becoming too quiet, as if everything that belonged to instinct had already left. Talia packed her sled and headed back to the lake. But this time, she didn't approach the edge. Instead, she climbed the low bluff to the west that gave a full view of the basin. From there, she saw it. At first glance, the lake looked solid, but there, at its very heart, a darkening patch. Not black, but no longer white. The snow had begun to melt inward, revealing glistening, translucent ice. And in that ice, faint lines, spiraling, not cracking, curling toward a single central point, like the lines of a fingerprint. She raised her binoculars. The spirals weren't random. They moved in a precise radius. A vortex, not caused by wind. There was no wind. Her heart thumped harder. If pressure was rising below, it was warming the ice from underneath and drawing snowmelt downward. That meant water movement, and water meant weakness. She grabbed her radio, but before she could speak, the ice shifted. She saw it clear as daylight. The dark patch pulsed. A vertical movement, not just a wave. The entire surface lifted by maybe 2 inches, and then fell again. It was breathing, or more precisely, releasing pressure in intervals. Suddenly, a sound cracked through the trees behind her. She turned sharply. Nothing. Then again, branches breaking. Movement. Heavy footfalls in the snow. She crouched low, hand on her flare gun. From the tree line emerged a moose. But it was moving wrong. Skittish, trembling, sides heaving. And behind it, a second one, bolting. Both veered away from the lake, crashing into the deeper forest. They weren't feeding. They were fleeing. Something below the lake was shifting faster now. Talia could feel it in the air pressure. It was like being on the edge of a storm that hadn't reached the surface yet. But when it did, the ice wouldn't crack like glass. It would open like a wound. The first break didn't come from the center. It came from the edge. Talia was reviewing her field recordings late that evening when the sensor by the northern tree line, the one least likely to move, went silent. Not offline, just no data. As if the microphone had been cleanly removed. She blinked, refreshed the feed, and froze. Pressure readings from the lake perimeter had dropped to 0, not uniformly, just in one location. A single quadrant had gone soft. She grabbed her boots and her parka, barely remembering to grab her radio before sprinting out into the cold. Snow flurries twisted in the windless air, and the trail to the lake was darker than usual. She descended the slope quickly, breath visible in bursts, her headlamp cutting through pale mist. At the lake's edge, everything looked normal, too normal. She crept closer, not onto the ice, just to the snow-packed boundary where the frozen shoreline met land. Her boots crunched quietly, then stopped. She looked down. A fracture line, barely visible beneath the powder, running parallel to the shore. It wasn't there yesterday, and it was fresh. The snow hadn't yet refilled it. She knelt, brushed it clean, and measured it with her eyes. It was spreading inward, not outward. That meant the land itself had slumped first, pulling at the ice from the sides. The lake wasn't cracking from the top down. It was being peeled from the edges, like the outer rim of a frozen plate giving way before the center shattered. She stood, her breath catching. The trees behind her, silent. The lake ahead, dead calm. Then came the sound. A soft groan. Subterranean. Long and slow, like a breath through stone. Then a pop. Then another. She staggered back as a section of shoreline directly across the lake caved inward, taking a few small pines with it. The collapse wasn't explosive. It was slow and deliberate, like something had eaten out the base of the lake and the rim was finally losing grip. And then came the air. She could see it, a sudden shimmer, heatless and low, like the kind of distortion that hovers over pavement in summer. Except it came from beneath the ice. Something was escaping now. Slowly. Gases, maybe. Pressure. But the real threat wasn't the gas. It was the timing. This was a pre-collapse tremor, a rehearsal. She backed away, nearly stumbling in the snow, her legs stiff with adrenaline. If the edges were giving way first, then soon the center would drop entirely. And when it did, anyone on that ice, or near it, would vanish into a sinkhole of freezing water and fractured stone. She had to warn the teams, but something in her gut said they might already be too late. They arrived just before dawn. A small convoy, 2 snowmobiles and 1 low-profile tracked ATV, headlights dimmed for stealth, tires crunching on frostbitten pine needles. Talia met them near the old ranger's shack, still wrapped in her parka, eyes sunken from the night's vigil. She didn't waste time on introductions. "Don't go near the lake," she said. "It's breathing." They blinked at her, half from the cold, half from disbelief. She pulled out her data loggers, temperature curves, seismic wavelets, sonar echoes from the under-ice probes she left tethered overnight. She showed them how the core of the lake had dropped several centimeters without any surface break, how the perimeter was hollowing outward, how the air pressure above the center was no longer stable. "It's going to give," she said, "but not like a break, like a bowl cracking from the inside." The team leader, Alvarez, quiet, skeptical but sharp, nodded slowly. And then he asked, "Where were the wolves seen last?" Talia pointed to the northern ridge. "Yesterday morning." Then they turned west. Fast, Alvarez paused. "Away from the lake?" "Yes." He nodded again. "Then that's our first evacuation line?" Something in her chest eased. Finally. Someone else who listened to the land like it meant something. They moved fast after that. Drones in the sky. Sensors deployed on sleds. Emergency notices pushed via satellite to isolated cabins in the area. And through it all, the lake remained quiet, waiting. Just after noon, they heard the first true collapse. Not a crack, a deep sub-ice moan, as if the ground below had sighed and let go. Talia and Alvarez watched from the ridge as the lake's center sank visibly, a slow spiral pulling the snow inward. No explosion, no ice shattering, just a spiral, folding. When it stopped, the middle of the lake had dropped by nearly a meter, and in its place was an eerie basin of glass-clear ice, bubbling quietly at the center. They never found a definitive explanation. Not a quake, not a methane burst, not even thawing permafrost. But Talia knew what had started it. She thought about that pack of wolves, the way they had stopped, turned, and left without hesitation. No sound, no confusion, just instinct. The wolves knew, not from science, not from instruments, but from something deeper, a pressure in the bones, an echo in the land, a message written into their blood. Long after the field teams left, Talia stayed. She placed a marker on the ridge where she first saw the wolves turn. A small wood carving, nothing official. Just a symbol, a wolf, mid-stride, facing away from the lake. Not out of fear, but because they were already listening to what the earth was saying beneath the ice.